Alright, in the last video we looked at some details about neurons, the structure and the function of nerve cells, and this is an advanced video that's going into some more detail. You need to make sure that you know all of the details from the last video, because this is more high level theory here. Okay, the first thing we're going to start with is a few new structures in a neuron. The first thing is in the gap here between one neuron and the next. Remember that neurons are in long chains and they pass the message from one neuron to the next. In that little gap between the neurons, there's a small space, and we call that the synapse. So it's just a tiny gap between the two neurons. And in that gap, there's a small chemical that's released called a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter, which carries the message across the synapse to the next neuron. There are a few different types of neurotransmitters, but we won't go into detail about those today. So the neurotransmitter carries the message from the axon terminal across the synapse to the next neuron. We also looked at the myelin sheath, which are these blue cells that are wrapped around the axon, and they protect the axon and speed up the message. Each one of these cells, though, is called a Schwann cell. That's named after the scientist or the researcher who discovered them. We can also see Schwann cell. We can also see there are gaps between each of those cells, and they're called nodes of Ranvier. And those little gaps are needed to pass the message along. We won't go into detail about that today either, though. Okay, now we're going to see how does the axon and the whole neuron pass that message along. Firstly, we need to remember that the message is electrical. The message is electrical. So you can imagine it like electricity moving through a wire. It starts at the cell body, moves down the axon, and out through the axon terminal. It's similar to electricity, but not exactly the same, but it's still a movement of charge. So the first step in the process happens right up here at the dendrites, where the neurotransmitter comes from the previous cell and attaches to the dendrites of this cell. So neurotransmitter, it carries the message and attaches to the dendrite. After those chemicals attach, the next step is inside the cell body, the charge changes. So the charge inside of a neuron is negative. You can imagine there are lots of small negative particles, and they're actually ions inside the cell. And when the neurotransmitters attach to the dendrite, they cause the cell body to become more positive. It loses some of that negative charge. So we can imagine it's becoming more positive. And if there's enough positive charge, then there's a region at the start of the axon called the Axon Hillock. That's one we didn't mention earlier. And the Axon Hillock is kind of like a roadblock. If there's enough positive charge, then it can get past the Axon Hillock, and then that causes the message to move along the axon. So the Axon Hillock begins the message. And it does that by causing more positive charge just at the start of the axon. And if we look at these three diagrams here, this is showing the same axon but at 3 different times. And remember, the inside of the axon is negative at the start. But once the message begins, this green area here is showing how the axon becomes positive, and we call that depolarization. It goes from negative to positive, and then just like ink spreading through water, that positive charge moves along to the next region. And we can see here the depolarized region moves along, and then it spreads along again, and the next region gets depolarized. So step 4 is the depolarized region moves all the way down the axon. Once it reaches the very end of the axon, which is called the axon terminal, then neurotransmitters are released from the very end, and they move across the synapse to the next neuron, and that starts the whole process again. So neurotransmitters are released up here at step 5. Neurotransmitters are released. The last thing we'll do is zoom in even further and have a look at the synapse, the gap between the neurons. And we can see it here. So this part here is the axon terminal of the previous neuron. So the message has come down the axon terminal, and this part at the bottom is the dendrite of the next neuron along in the chain. We can see there are vesicles here, and these store the neurotransmitter chemicals. Vesicles store the neurotransmitters, so they're waiting ready to go. And then once that depolarized region moves down to the bottom of the axon terminal, remember there's a positive charge that moves down. Once that positive charge reaches the vesicles, they detect it, and then you can see here they release all of those neurotransmitter molecules, and they move through the small gap in the synapse and attach to the dendrite at the bottom here. And these purple parts represent chemicals that begin the positive charge again in the next cell body along.